Hello, everyone. Good morning, and welcome to this International Women's Day. So, I'm delighted you're joining me. Today, what we're going to cover is myth busting. International Women's Day this year is about inspired inclusion. So, I thought I'd cover four regular myths that are happening about women in the workplace, which are getting in the way of them being able to fully contribute and find equality. So, as you probably know, I'm Mary Maguire. I'm the founder of Agents to Change. We started 16 years ago, and we've been helping companies build belonging over that time. I'm also the author of a number of books, The Inclusion Edge, which helps all leaders learn how to spearhead diversity and inclusion, and also The Female Edge, which helps women find career success. International Women's Day, interesting event, isn't it? It's been around for well over 100 years now. So it started as a women's socialist event in the US. I think it was about 1916, 1918. So quite a long time ago now. And if we think about what the world was like for women then, they had no rights to property on their own. They had no political rights. They had no economic independence of their own. It was very difficult for women to find work and run businesses. And even their status was very much about them being part of a man's chattels, man's property. So they were either his wife, his daughter, his mother, or his sister, and that was how their status was defined. So we can see that the world in that time has come a long way, and we have enormous strides that we've made for women in the modern world. But we still have a way to go, and we know that. And I'll share some of the things that share that with us. But if you're on the live stream, and you've got any comments, do share them in the post, and I will come back to you as soon as I can. So where do we start? So let's start with myth one. So this is not entirely, but myth one: do women have nothing to say? Well, that's a bit of a controversial one, but let me give you some statistics first. If we look at the situation in terms of data, what it tells us is women, only 85 of them get promoted for every 100 men, and I'll go into that data a bit more. 50% of leaders from what we call majority culture, so the ones who represent the majority, the native, the indigenous people of that place, feel that diversity, equity, and inclusion is just too difficult to deal with. So that's half of all of the major leaders in organisations. 1 in 4 women in 2020 decided to leave employment. That has slowed down since, but it was at a faster pace than men. So we already had a gap between men and women equally represented in the workplace, and then that got worse. So we know that COVID was a big example of that. Even though there are companies out there that are spending the most on diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives and programs and training and development, are still struggling with the representation targets, and most of them have only achieved about 35%. And of women to men in the workplace. And if we actually layer on any other diverse characteristics, intersectionality as we call it, such as women of colour, women with disabilities, women who identify as lesbian or bisexual or in any part of the LGBTQ community, they definitely have more of a harder time in the workplace. For example, women of colour have to put in 60% more job applications, even if they have the same abilities of people out there, whether they're men or women, and they happen to be white. And AI doesn't always help us with this. We have to remember that AI was built with the same limitations on it that we see in the bias that exists in us as human beings. So Amazon had a very famous, and I have to say now, defunct AI program to help with their high volume recruitment. So they brought an AI tool to help with the first level of screening. And what they found was that it screened out twice as many women and people of colour through the AI version than they did actually if they left the humans to do it the slow way. So we have to remember that while technology brings us a huge amount, it doesn't solve all of our problems. So that's an important thing to remember. So let's look at what we've got as the first myth. Oh, and I'm sorry, my slides aren't sharing very well there. Um, Women have less to say. What we actually find is it's not that women have less to say; it's women get less airtime to say what they've got to say. This is a fairly famous situation where when Taylor Swift was getting her award, she was interrupted and the microphone was taken off her to be told that there was somebody else out there that was a better female artist than her, with that person's husband. You probably know the event; it's quite a famous one, but it is representative of what happens a lot in the workplace all over, and we have a lot of research to tell us this. In fact, the research goes back over 50 years, and what it says is that women get less airtime in meetings, they get more interrupted in meetings, and they find that their interruptions are more by men. Hence the phrase that's more recently been coined, which is manterruptions. The A few other places where we found that, one of them was men interrupting women more frequently in places like the Supreme Court. So female justices were interrupted twice as much as their male justices when they were trying to do their job. So it's not just something that's happening in the workplace. It's happening all over. We're finding this. What does that mean? What's the impact of that? Well, the impact of it is quite significant, certainly for women. One of the main ones is reduced confidence. If you think of somebody over talking you all the time, you do feel less confident about who you are, whether you have a right to be there, whether people are willing to listen to you. And that can make you hesitant to speak up and feel that you stay quiet more often. The other thing we're having is a loss of valuable ideas. If we're constantly screening out or censoring women and their voices, we're stopping them from giving their unique perspective and the insights that they might bring, which are often quite different from their male colleagues because their lived experience will be different. So there's opportunities here that are being left on the table because of this behaviour. And the final one is the culture of bias that this creates. Now, if you think about it, um, if we have interruptions happening all the time, and it's so part of the fabric of why we do things, we don't see it. We get this unconscious bias that men's contributions are just more important, and we listen to them more. So, if I think about what that might mean, we can see that. Um, Let me just make sure I haven't gone too far. No, I haven't. Um, we can see that there are things that we can do to help with that. So the first one is just think about what's happening in your meetings. The first step often is observation. So if you don't think that's happening in your regular dialogue and meetings and other events that are happening, maybe just start observing it. One of the simple things I suggest people do is actually just record it with people's permission, obviously, but use something like an Otter AI or some other transcribing tool. Record the meeting and then look back and see what's happening and seeing if you are seeing this manterruptions happening. Other things, establish ground rules. Think about whether you have established ground rules for respectful communication in your workplace. And if you have, maybe revisit them and agree what they need to do again. Ally intervention is really important. So it shouldn't always be the woman trying to talk about the woman's need for respect, for the opportunity to speak, for acknowledgement of their work. There's lots of men out there who can be equally helpful. So if you, as a man, see a woman being interrupted, you can intervene and remind other people and establish the rules. And then as a woman, if you are finding that somebody's interrupted you and stolen your thunder, although interruptions can feel quite jarring, and we have this socialization that it's very rude to interrupt people. But re-interrupting is just taking back the power. And maybe a simple phrase like, oh, if I could just come back to the point I was making, as I was saying, and then carry on making the point. And that can just smoothly bring the attention and the authority back to you. It's very rare that somebody re-interrupts twice. They do, but then it becomes more of an obvious dynamic for anyone else to see. So that's just something to think about there in terms of why that happens, why we think that there's this myth that women have less to say, and of course they don't. So let's go on to the next thing. So the next myth we have, I got my handwritten, um, hand-drawn things. You can see I've never gone to art school. So myth two. Myth two is a lack of expertise. So if we look around in the world of science and engineering and mathematics and medical advancements, we would often be uh, surprised to find that we don't see as many women's names in there as men. But again, this comes down to quite a few things. And let's start with the obvious question. And again, sorry, my slide. For some reason, StreamYard strips down all things, and it doesn't display as nicely. I've forgotten this. I'll make sure I do it next time. But let's start with the obvious question: is there a genuine difference between the intelligence of men and women? Because that's what's implied in this overall authority arc of the majority of the leaders, pioneers, the big thinkers in these areas, particularly the STEM areas, are seen as male. Well, a few things. American parents are 2.5 times more likely to try and find out if their son is gifted than if their daughter is gifted, which in itself suggests that there's a bias there about assuming where gifted lies. And if we ask people to self-assess their level of IQ, what we found is that adult men put on average their IQ as 110 and women put their IQ as 105. So again, we have this thing of just men feeling more confident about their intelligence than women. But the evidence doesn't bear that out. In fact, what we know is girls on average get higher grades at school, and they're more likely to win places of university, and they're more likely to go on to do master courses and further study beyond then. So it's important for us to think about what that bias might be that might be playing out. So let's see what the research tells us about that. The impact of denying people work is actually quite extensive. So what we know is there's a number of ways that comes out. So falsely attributing work to men, not just in STEM, so that's the science and technology and engineering and mathematics areas, but in business as well. Men get more kudos for delivering projects than women. We also know that there's a recent research that a science journal found that areas of research, if it was a man done it, they got 3 times more citation than a woman, even if then research papers were equally valid. Same with things like authors in the non-fiction space and mathematics awards and them going more disproportionately to men. So we know that there's this bias towards just assuming that men have more authority in this area. The other thing we see is undermining the women's contributions. So what we do is we create the illusion that women are the supporters of men and their research and their intelligence. And what that does, what that filters down to in the reality is that we are limiting the choices. There's a lack of visibility on women's contributions. And that means that they often miss out on opportunities for promotion, for funding if they're in the STEM area, or just for showcasing their skills. Annika, great to have you here. Yeah, ally intervention, I think, is a really important one. And I think you're right. I said if you're a man, ally intervention, but you're absolutely right, Annika. If you're a woman, a senior woman, or a woman who has more power and influence on the stage or the event you're in, you can also be an ally to another woman. Completely agree with that. Yeah, and man-interrupting, very new one. Cultural differences in countries as well is true. I think that there's an awful lot of different layers to how we see these gender socialization and how they're playing out. So there's a lot of things that are going on there. Brilliant, thank you. It's lovely, lovely to get the comments. Thank you. Right, the second. Is that the second? Yeah, I'm on myth 3 already. Gosh, I'm doing well. So the third myth is women need a longer runway. And what I'm going to talk about is this figure here, 85 to 100. What do I mean by that? Well, let's look at what's going on here. Um, I just wanted to show you probably one of the biggest demonstrations of what we're finding with this slower journey to promotion for women in the career. Now, this is not my research. This is the wonderful McKinsey and Leaning's annual report, Women in the Workplace. Brilliant report. If you want to have some understanding of the gender dynamics and the implications and the impact that's having on women and men in the workplace, do get that report. It's available free. You can download it, but it has some great research in it. But I thought this was a really, really good example of what's happening. So if you think about it, what it's showing us here is from entry level, from the first time people enter the workplace, all the way through the levels up until they get to a group senior level, a C-suite level, as they call it. And then along this pipeline, they've got these different colours. So white men, men of colour, white women, and women of colour. And what we're seeing is how quickly do they get promoted? Now, this is really important because what we can see is the ones who get faster are faster to be reported, to promoted, sorry, are the ones who win out in the long term. So on that first rung of the leadership ladder, the first rung of a management role, when people are entering the workplace, the majority of that goes to white men. And then we do see white women coming up as well. If you have other diversity traits, men of colour don't do so well, women of colour, and then we could actually go down the other diversity traits. But we are still seeing that there's still quite a difference in that, in terms of the overall numbers. Now, if everything else is equal, we'd wonder why these aren't more equally spread out. So the fact that even this rung is so differentiated, so granulated according to the identity of the person, doesn't itself show the bias. But what becomes stronger is as you go to each level. So as the person, the first movers, if you like, into the leadership rung of the ladder, they then definitely continue to see the advancement as they go up. And therefore, it squeezes the size of the pie for everyone else. Excuse me, I've got a little bit of a cough. You know it's live when you're seeing that. Excuse me. So when you get to the top level, the C-suite, the most senior level in organisations, what you're seeing is the more than the lion's share of that, 56% of that is your white men. And then all of the other diversity areas have been squeezed. So they have a lot less of the slices of the cake as they go up because of this. Now, you have to question what is happening there, and there's a few things. So let me share a few of them with you. You might have seen this brilliant book by Thomas Chamorro Premusic. I probably said it wrong, so Thomas, if you ever hear it, sorry. But he wrote a great book saying, "Why do so many incompetent men become leaders?" Clearly, a bit of an emotive title, but you know there was an issue about what is happening here. And essentially, what he pinpointed was what we'd call performance bias. And that very clearly has a gender lens to it. So, in essence, what do? We promote men based on their potential to do a job. We promote women based on their proof that they can do a job, their actual performance. Now, what does that mean? Well, what that means is that there's a time lag. There's a time lag between a man showing potential, so not needing to prove himself and being promoted quicker, and a woman waiting until she's completely at the level of competence and then being promoted. So that time lag, as we've seen in the previous pipeline, definitely creates that imbalance as we get further up an organisation. And I've talked about the acceleration. Um, and I think that the question that Thomas was asking in his book, and I think it's the one that we could all ask is, but if we always do that, if we use this performance lens, are we always putting the right person, the most competent person in that level of leadership? Um, the performance bias, the impact of it, I think that there's a couple of things, and they're very similar to myth too. The one of them is that we have this unconscious bias to believe in that men make better leaders than women. And there's lots of studies and research that we can see about that. And not only in terms of business life, throughout public life generally. So we have this view that to be a good leader, you have to be a male. Um, and then that performance bias leads to a lot of examples of how the career paths, the competency models, the reward models, the judgments and the criteria we apply to people very much has that performance bias. So in essence, we're giving more slack to men that they probably can do a job and less slack to women that they probably can't do the job. That's essentially what the gap is, that tension that happens with that. But what can you do about that? I mean, what are the things that we can do if this myth is playing out? So, if you are a manager and you are involved in any way in recruiting people or identifying project teams or in meetings where you're talking about promotion or potential of people, maybe look at the decisions that are being made and look at the criteria that's being applied. Look at the language that's being used, especially when you're doing things. If you are involved in things like talent management, is there different language applied, whether it's a male employee to a female employee? Are there different languages applied when you're looking at people that you're recruiting? And they're the places where we can actually look at, are we using the same criteria, the same approach to each person equally? And just even raising that question in a meeting as you're going through decisions can in itself help to open up and maybe look at that. The other thing that we know helps, and this again, I'm talking specifically about women because it's International Women's Day, but if we could actually move that down lens, women of colour, women with disabilities, women of the LGBTQ community, they all actually struggle in terms of being able to find their niche, find their support, find their tribe in organisations, and their tribe gets even less and less as they go further up an organisation. So sponsorship and support can be hugely helpful. So can you be an ally for a woman or who might need support in their career? Or can you be influential in helping your organisation to maybe create these spaces where there can be sponsorship and support created? That can make an enormous difference. Even somebody knowing they're not the only one, they're not alone, that that their isolation can be recognised or that their struggle can be recognised in a supportive way and resources given to them, that can make a huge difference. Think about how that can be done. And the final one is look at things like expectations for a role, whether that's an internal role or a developmental role, like a project role, or you're recruiting people externally. Think really about the expectation for the role. And is there an implied gender dimension? You'd be surprised how much there is in the way that we write job descriptions, in the way that we use language, in the criteria that we put in what we put in the person specification. And some of what we need to think about, and this goes back to the previous one, performance bias, we need to think about how that is read as well. So if you're a man, because if you're used to being promoted on your potential, you'll only see the need to maybe have 50-60% of that criteria in your bag and that you've proved your worth before you apply for the job, because there's enough potential in you, because you've always heard that, for you to be a good candidate. If you're a woman, you're waiting to see if you've got 90-95% of all of that criteria in the bag, because what you've heard is you have to prove you've done it before we'll take you seriously. So think about how you create even the opportunities in your organisation that might be giving some implied gender bias there. And the fourth one, this one's going to be controversial, so let me share it. The fourth myth is that for women, their career is just less important. And yes, I have shown a woman with a baby, and no, I'm not implying that all women have babies. But let me share with you another piece of research which I think really helps to put this in perspective. Again, from the brilliant Women in the Workplace research from McKinsey and Lean. Sorry, I forgot to put the attribution there. This is another really, really important way of actually showing what's happening here. So what we have is we have the different levels of management here. So we have entry level, male, female, first level, and senior management and up. And what we're showing here in this graph, I'm not showing, I'm not that clever, but McKinsey and Lean were that clever, is what is the additional responsibility. So these are the caring responsibilities. So that might be families, housework, childcare, other caring responsibilities, older parents, or other people with additional needs in their family unit that they need to care for. So at entry level, for men, they declared that they had 30% of other work and time that they had to spend on family and household duties. And women are almost twice that at entry level, 58%. So what does that mean? What it means is that women, have to allow a certain amount of their mental bandwidth when they're at work to be available for anything else that might tick over that they need to spend time on, whether it's children, whether it's something that happened at school, whether that's something happened with a parent, whether that's dealing with something in the household, like the boiler's broken down. It's more likely to have been put in her basket than it is in the man's. Now, here's the other interesting dynamic that was shown here. It's 30% to entry level. As we go up, first line manager, look what's happened here. It's dropped. It's dropped by a third, quite a significant amount. But the women, it hasn't dropped at all. So they've gone up to the next level of management, but they've still got this double jobbing to do where they've got quite a few things to balance at home, as well as doing more responsibility in the workplace. And then as we go up to senior management and up, again, look what happens here. Men, 13%. So their need to think about anything outside of work has been stretched down to a very small degree. Yes, they're involved. Yes, they're doing things, but it's 13% of their time. And look what's happened here. Women's has gone down a bit, and that's probably because they've got more helping as they've got older. But it's still very high, 52%. So they're holding down a senior job. And they're delivering everything that's expected in their career, and they're still having to keep the bandwidth to think about all of the other things in their extra job, their double job that they might have to deal with. And you can see how that affects dynamics in the workplace. Annika, thanks again for your comments. So you heard years ago that the one reason women more often reach higher levels in countries like Spain and Italy compared to Northern Europe was that there was more normal acceptance in Southern Europe to hire people to help out at home. Oh no, I can't speak to that, Annika. That's brilliant. What I do know is where this goes down, so this 52%, is because on average, as they get more income, so first level manager, there's not enough disposable income, but as they go up the management levels, there is more disposable income to send children out to more childcare if they need to do wraparound care around school, or bringing in support in the home. So some of that drop is not because the overall responsibility has dropped, but because they can get more care in. But no, I didn't know that there was more help generally in some of the European countries. So it's good to know. Really, really great comment. Thank you. So let's look at what that means. What we have seen is that there's an implication for how women are seen in the career. And let me share a few things to you, and then I'll share an anecdote which I got yesterday in a workshop I was in with one of my organisations. So we do see that career and organisational expectations need to move with the times. Now, what we have seen is that COVID has really spun the axis completely in terms of where we are in the way that we do work. Hybrid working has definitely been a huge boon for women. It's definitely helped them. But it's not the end of the story. What we still find is poorly timed meetings, intolerance to interruptions if people are on Zoom from family members, which is a reality for the women who have 58% responsibilities in addition to the work, and things like microaggressions happening when women are mentioning things like, "I have to, we have to finish this meeting and I have to go on a school run." There's still this sort of implied thing about we don't want to hear of anything outside of work coming into the dialogue of work. And that's easy when you're a senior manager and there's only 10% of your time that needs to think about all these other things. But if it's over 50% of your time, you can't help it. The commitment to work and career as well is still, even now, measured by who you know and who knows you. The appearance of working hard can be more important than actual results. Showing up to certain meetings, being able to go to the networking meetings, being able to go to the after work drinks and having the informal conversations with some of the influencers in your organisation, that can make a big difference. And for certain women, that's just not an option for them. They have to balance different things. And then the other thing we are seeing is career paths still have an unconscious bias and often a language and a framework that goes with it towards men as ideal candidates. And we've seen that in many ways, but probably one of the ones that's still prevalent is this idea of presenteeism. I can get into work early, I can work late if I need to, I can go to another country and deal with an issue at the drop of a hat. And the career paths and the expectations and the way we measure people is very much with these implied bias, which very much have a bias towards men. So we're often seeing that women, while they may have great skills and great experience, are often seen as the weaker option. And that's even judged by women as well. That's not just men judging it that way. So we still have a long way to go with this. But what can you do? Just thinking about this is, there's lots of things we can do about this. The picture isn't all bleak. We are seeing movement with this. But even with this myth about women not being as serious about their career, which is untrue, we just need to think about how we can help them with this. So one of the things is you could discuss hybrid and flexibility with your employees. So even if you're not in a position where you can affect the policy at macro level in your organisation, you can at a micro level. Oh yes, and let me share. There's two examples I'll share with this one as well. So you could look to set up sensible boundaries that respect the work-life realities they're dealing with. I want to just go back to the anecdote. So yesterday I was in a workshop and there was one of the women who's just recently returned to work after having a baby, and she's got two small children now. Very committed to her career, very committed to the organisation she's working in, loving the role that she's got. And she says, "But I can only work part-time. That's the reality for our work, our family, and how we're set up. And I know that for the next 4 or 5 years at least, I have to accept my career is stalled. I will not be able to do anything but stay at this level or work at something that's a horizontal move for the next 4 to 5 years. That's not because I'm not developing new skills. I don't have more to give to the organisation. I don't have talents I can flex to. It's just because the part-time work is seeing me as less valuable to the organisation." And I would imagine there's an awful lot of women out there who feel like that. Part-time does not mean that there's not the talent and the skill to give. And the hybrid and flexibility one, again, another really lovely example recently with somebody that they were dealing with some difficulties at home, and they had a grandparent who was dying who lived in another country who they'd been very close to, and they wanted to get away to deal with that. They could have said nothing, but they knew that their manager could support them. So they sat down with them, they explained how difficult this was for them, and they actually just found a way to put together enough days for that person to be able to fly to the other country, spend time with their grandparent, deal with, the loss, and then come back to work. And they felt supported with that. So while it's different from some of the other issues, how we can find hybrid and flexibility can be something we can do as a line manager working with teams. The other thing is you can set guardrails around meetings and working days. And what I mean by guardrails is, when do we really have to start meetings? when could we really put an end to meetings? Now, I know that there's some things like time zones we have to allow for, and obviously that's the reality. But again, recently I was speaking to one of my organisations, and they were saying, there's often meetings put in the diary at 8:30. Now, if you're part time, or if you are the woman with the additional 58% responsibilities of getting the kids to school on time, an 8:30 meeting is a killer. And the question would be, did it really need to be in at 8:30, or was it just that certain employees could get in bright and early to the office and they thought, I'm in early, I'll make sure everyone's going to be at this meeting. So really think about, where do we really need to set the times? Can we consider setting a certain amount of hours in the day and say, these are our meeting hours. No meeting goes on before this time. No meeting goes on after this time. And I know that might feel like we're losing productivity, but the reality is meetings don't need to happen all the time. And what we're doing is we're allowing people very clear time in the day where they can get on with catching up with their emails, following up phone calls, doing the actions that came out of all the meetings that they've been in. So guardrails can be really helpful, and they very much help to balance that gender dimension. And then I know many organisations have no meet Fridays, just say Friday's a day where we don't set any regular meetings. We might have ad hoc, we might have things, but generally that's not a day we have meetings. Again, very helpful. And then respect boundaries. And I mean boundaries across all the time zones you're working in. So think about, when does communication need to go out, and when is the active hours for that particular group that you're working with. So if it's people in California and you are working in the UK, sending them a meeting, sending them an email or an urgent request at 10 a.m. your time is not very helpful, because if they've left their phone and they've got something blinking and suddenly they've woken up in the middle of the night and they're in quite a high stress situation because something seems urgent that they feel they have to get up and deal with. So respecting the time zones, and thinking about, if I'm working at 8 p.m. because I've got something urgent to do that is needed for the next morning, do I need to send that out to everyone at this time? Or could I time my email to be at a sensible time before the meeting? So think about that, because they all help to balance out the challenges, particularly when we know that we've got lots of people in our workforce, women, who are having to double job between one and the other thing. So they're just some simple actions. So that's the 4 myths. Hope you found that useful, and thank you very much for the comments. I found that really useful as well. What I'd like to say is, maybe you think about an action you can take. So I've covered the 4 myths, and how they affect people. So the mantle options, not attributing work to women, assuming that they're not taking their career seriously, and they're double jobbing. That's the reality for them. So, based on what you've heard, can you think about one action from the suggestions I've made that you could take and you could commit to maybe help to address some of that gender bias that still exists? And maybe just give a woman either a helping hand up, or give them a little space to just feel supported, to feel heard, and to feel that they're not alone in their struggle. And then maybe think about how you will keep that commitment going. What are the things that you could do to maybe keep that commitment going? And I know you know me on LinkedIn. Sorry, some great further reading. Obviously, my book, The Inclusion Edge, and The Female Edge that I mentioned to you. A great book called Belonging, which is very much an organisational dimension about how to build it. If you want to know more specifically about how did gender bias shows up, a brilliant book here, The Authority Gap by Mary Ann Sieghart, which really shows what's happening and how that affects things. And then the book that I also mentioned, Why Do So Many Men Become Incompetent Leaders? Another great book to delve into. So if you wanted to read more on the subject. And as always, I love to hear from you. So if you've got anything that you'd like to hear more about, email me, maryagentstochange.com. You will know me on LinkedIn if that's where you're listening. I'm on Twitter, and you can find me on Facebook and YouTube as well. So thank you very much for your time. I hope you found it useful, and I'm wishing you a fabulous International Women's Day. Thank you for your time, and I hope that you feel inspired to do more to support women towards the journey to gender equity. Thanks very much. Have a great day. Bye for now.